Welcome, voyager. Tonight we wander not into a storm or a shipwreck, but into a shimmering tide where the ocean itself was once valued bead by bead. A place where the waves held more than salt and foam, but strings of color, of glass, of currency. Along the soft curve of the West African coast, under canopies of palm and cloud, Portuguese ships once drifted in on the tide, their holds not packed with spices or silver, but with something softer than gold. Beads. Tonight's tale takes us into that gentle shimmer, a coastal exchange not of conquest, but of color, and the quiet way beauty sometimes buys more than bullion ever could. It's the only economy in history where a misplaced marble might bankrupt a sailor, and where a string of beads could buy you land, friendship, or even forgiveness. You could say it was the only market where losing your necklace might literally cost you your neck. Before we set sail, if you find stories like this help you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop the coordinates of where you're listening from in the comments. If there's a bead of history in your region, we just might string it into a future tale. Now get comfortable. You can imagine a soft palm front brushing against your window, the hush of waves drawing near, a light evening heat touching your arms. Let the world grow quiet. The trades have stopped. The ships are in. The beads glint in moonlight. And our story tonight sets sail at the edge of the Gulf of Guinea, sometime around the early 1500s, when ships out of Lisbon moved slow and heavy through warm Atlantic water, down the western contour of Africa, their sails slack under calm skies. The wind, if it blew at all, blew lazily, like a breath not meant to stir. The Portuguese, who had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope and traced their finger eastward to India, were now turning their gaze toward a coast less known and yet remarkably rich in culture, song, and silent knowledge. This part of the world, from Senegal to Nigeria, was already long connected by inland trade routes and oral cartographies, where information passed not through inked maps, but from tongue to ear, in dialects shaped by distance. Goods had always moved here. Cola nuts, ivory, copper, salt. But now, as the Portuguese arrived by sea, a new item entered the exchange. An odd one, if you thought about it too hard. Tiny spheres of colored glass, looped into necklaces or stored in sacks, each bead carrying within it a fragment of Venetian light, Bohemian sand, or Moorish fire. You see, these beads had been made far from Africa's shores. Some in Venice, where the glass blowers of Murano spun molten silica into spirals and droplets. Others from the bead makers of Amsterdam or the Czech highlands, where forest fires fed the furnaces, and hands shaped the trade one molten drip at a time. And they weren't made merely for beauty. They were made to move, to cross oceans, to become coin. The Portuguese called them contas or micangas, and they carried them in huge numbers, often more than silver. A ship might carry 100 sacks of them, sorted by color, size, and purpose. There were blue beads that shimmered like the sky in Lisbon, red beads said to hold the spirit of fire, black beads so smooth they looked like polished jet. Each had its market, and those markets were not random. The coastal communities of West Africa had long-standing tastes and preferences, not unlike our own, and what sold in the Gambia might not charm in Benin. Some preferred the millefiori beads with their floral cross-sections, others the simple, bold rounds that caught light like dew. And here, in this tide of soft commerce, emerged entire economies that did not center on gold or violence, but on color, tactility, and the delicate shimmer of things that could be worn and displayed. In places like Elmina, which had been a modest settlement before the Portuguese built their trading post there in 1482, these beads became a backbone of exchange. Local leaders, intermediaries, and traders often dealt in long, braided strands, bartered for cloth, palm oil, ivory, or tragically, in time, for people. It's important to note that this story, while soft in tone, does not soften the truth. The same beads that bought goods in peaceful exchange were later entangled in darker trades. The Atlantic slave trade, which would come to define centuries of sorrow, often saw these same beads used as currency. One ship's manifest from the early 1700s records over 100,000 glass beads loaded for a voyage to West Africa, many of which were intended to be exchanged for enslaved persons. The contradiction is hard to ignore, that something so beautiful could be threaded into such cruelty. But like most histories, this one is not simple. It is layered, like the translucent shells of the beads themselves. Still, in the earliest moments of the trade, before conquest drowned out curiosity, the exchange was often mutual, negotiated, and deeply cultural. There are accounts of local craftspeople reworking the beads, melting and reforming them into their own shapes. Some buried them with the dead, believing the colors would light the journey beyond. Others embedded them into shrines, divination boards, or sacred masks. They weren't just ornaments, they were meaning worn. One story, recounted by a 17th century Dutch traveler, tells of a chief who wore a vest covered entirely in beads. Each bead, he said, represented an agreement, a story, a person. To touch one was to touch memory. It wasn't currency, it was archive. By the mid-1500s, Portuguese forts dotted the coast. At Axum, at Luanda, at São Tomé, each a node in a growing network of trade. Ships would arrive with beads and sail back with goods. Pepper, ivory, gold. The ocean, it seemed, had become an embroidery loom, stitching together distant worlds with loops of translucent thread. You could follow the beads backward, from Guinea to Lisbon, to the canals of Murano, and even further, to the sands where the glass was born. To the modern mind, it's odd. Why would glass matter so much? Why would it trade for anything of value? But to understand this, you must let go of modern price tags. These beads weren't cheap trinkets. They were rare, they were luminous, and in many places, they echoed the colors of the earth, the sky, or the stories people told. In a world without plastic, without factories, without mass production, a bead of polished glass was a miracle, a stone that held the sun. And so, in this quiet period of exchange, before the storms, before the horrors, the ocean was a channel of color. Imagine it now, if you like, a line of ships just visible at the horizon, their sails billowed lightly, a soft breeze pushing through tall palms. On shore, someone runs their hand through a basket of beads, sunlight catching in every surface, turning a quiet morning into a kaleidoscope. The glass beads, glimmering with an almost oceanic translucence, were not simply trinkets. Each one held a value beyond its weight, its shimmer, or its smallness. The Portuguese called them micangas and carried them in bulk from the glass furnaces of Murano, Venice, or the workshops of Antwerp, Bruges, and later Amsterdam. They came in cobalt blues, milky whites, sometimes amber or deep forest green, each color chosen deliberately. They were light, compact, and cheap to produce. But on the Atlantic coast of West Africa, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they were as persuasive as gold, as binding as ink. The coastal kingdoms had long practiced trade, long before the caravels of Portugal rounded the Cape Bajador. Inland networks crisscrossed the Sahel, from the Niger to the Congo, from Mali's gold-laced rivers to the salt pans of Tagaza. When the Europeans arrived by sea, they stepped into a system already humming with rhythm and logic. Beads, those tiny orbs of spun fire, simply became another verse in the chorus. But they were versatile, decorative, negotiable, strung around wrists, sewn into clothing, passed from hand to hand as adornment and proof of alliance. They became memory made tangible. Some of the earliest Portuguese traders, men like Diogo Chao and later Duarte Pacheco Pereira, learned quickly that beads opened doors. Not all coastal rulers were eager to trade. Some were cautious, some calculating. But where gold was guarded, where ivory was rare, glass beads flowed freely. And so did stories. There are records of sailors watching as their cargo was pulled inland by porters, disappearing upriver, disappearing into forests, only to return weeks later as new goods. Skins, spices, feathers, and even people. One might wonder how something so small could carry so much weight. But in societies where meaning was woven into gesture, into ornament, into the visible signs of prestige and status, a string of carefully chosen beads could speak volumes. Some represented loyalty, others diplomacy. In some regions, red beads were reserved for royalty. In others, clear ones adorned the newlywed. Patterns mattered. Combinations mattered. A misstep in offering was not just a trade error, it could be an insult. And in this exchange, the ocean was not passive. It wasn't merely the path or stage. It was the storehouse, the keeper. For hundreds of years, broken beads spilled overboard. Strings unraveled. Whole crates slipped beneath waves and storms, wrecks, or skirmishes. Today, divers along the coasts of Ghana and Nigeria still find these remnants nestled in coral or lodged in estuarine mud. In Lagos Lagoon, traders once walked barefoot over buried cargo, never knowing that centuries-old glass glinted beneath them, washed up by tides or exposed by erosion. Even now, locals speak of finding them after heavy rains, unearthed from ancient riverbanks. They are worn, dulled, but intact. A flash of blue among brown reeds. A ghost of commerce returned to the surface. In those moments, the beads are no longer just artifacts. They are storytellers. Proof that people once crossed oceans with pockets full of fire-fused promises. Some European traders began commissioning specific designs, knowing which colors and shapes would be best received. Chevron beads, with their layered stars, became prized. So too did slave beads, a name both grim and historical, used in the darkest corridors of the Atlantic economy. These were beads not simply for friendship or ornament, but exchanged in the brutal trade of human lives. Men and women, stolen or sold, were bought with beads. The very objects that symbolized beauty and alliance in one context were twisted into tools of exploitation in another. And so, the ocean remembers both. It remembers the gentle trade of coastal friendship, where strings of blue glass marked treaty or marriage. But it also remembers the shackles hidden beneath the decks of the very same ships. Some beads found their way to the necks of kings, others to the wrists of the condemned. But even in sorrow, the ocean was witness. It held the record. In a letter dated 1505, written by a Portuguese factor stationed in Mina, modern-day Elmina, Ghana, there is mention of a box of beads so fine, so delicately crafted, that the local ruler refused to take them in trade, fearing they were too beautiful to be real. He thought they might be magical. He asked for rougher ones instead, the kind his people could trust. There's something profoundly human in that detail. The idea that value was not in perfection, but in familiarity. That beads too polished, too flawless, were met with suspicion. That the ocean's currency worked best when it felt like it belonged. When it echoed the textures, colors, and irregularities of the land it washed against. The ocean of glass, then, was not uniform. It shimmered in different hues depending on who beheld it. To a trader in Lisbon, it was profit. To a king in Benin, it was prestige. To a woman in Luanda, perhaps it was memory. A necklace handed down, the story of an ancestor tied into each bead. And to the sea itself, they were seeds scattered across centuries, waiting to bloom in the minds of those curious enough to look. Our story tonight does not seek to judge those who cross the waters, beads in hand, but it does pause with them. It watches as they stand on sandy shores, presenting strands of color to strangers whose language they barely knew. It listens to the silence between exchanges, the way one hand reached out and another accepted, and sometimes the way hands were withdrawn. It is easy to romanticize these moments, to see only the glint of sun on glass, or the symmetry of necklaces lined up in museum cases. But this ocean, the one made of beads, was never just decorative. It was political, emotional. It was a mirror for power and for trust, a medium through which people tried, in all their flawed ways, to connect. And the sea, always listening, always pulling things inward, kept those attempts, preserved them in salt and sediment, waiting for us, centuries later, to remember that even the smallest objects can carry the greatest stories. Along the mangrove-lined shorelines of the Bight of Benin, the glass beads changed hands like secrets whispered across generations. Among the Fan and the Yoruba, the arrival of European ships bearing beads sparked not only trade, but a careful dance of negotiation and symbolism. Blue beads, in particular, came to carry weight beyond their shimmer. They represented sky, water, and divinity. In rituals and ceremonies, a single strand might grace the neck of a priest, or be buried with the dead, not as payment, but as passage. European traders did not always understand this, but they observed. A captain from Lisbon once noted in his log that he had offered an entire crate of beads in exchange for a small ivory carving, thinking he had overpaid. But his hosts had given it with laughter, not because the exchange was foolish, but because the carving was never for sale. It had been a gift, and the beads, with their delicate imperfections, had simply been accepted in return as a matter of politeness. To the Europeans, beads were commerce. To the coastal kingdoms, they were conversation. Further inland, through forests that held their own myths, glass beads became silent ambassadors. They traveled not just in baskets, but in stories. A trader from Ouida might recount how a Portuguese ship carried sunlight in boxes, or how beads were made by men who never touched fire. These stories warped with the telling, yet carried something true in their shape, because somewhere in the beads there was memory, of touch, of color, of origin, and it clung to the thread. In time, European empires grew hungrier. Gold dust gave way to slaves, and the glass bead trade twisted into something crueler. Along the coast, forts rose like broken teeth. Almena, Axen, São Jorge de Mina. Behind their walls, ledgers replaced language, and beads became tools of bondage. For every man sold, there was a tally. For every child taken, a string of blue and white. Still, the beads survived, hidden beneath floorboards, sewn into the hems of tunics, passed from mother to daughter. They remained, a whisper of what had been, not currency, not bribe, but keepsake. Some stories say that the waters off the slave coast shimmered brighter because of the beads thrown overboard, either in panic or in protest, whether by those who would not sell or by those who would not be bought. And so the ocean, already heavy with salt and sorrow, took on a quiet glint, as if its surface were dusted with starlight that had lost its way. A Portuguese map from 1623 shows the Gulf of Guinea as a wide, rolling bay, labeled with Latin script and the clean sweep of a quill. But it omits the color. It does not show the deep cerulean of the sky reflected in waves, or the way the shallows gleamed when sunlight caught the flecks of glass beneath. Nor does it show the boats, small, carved canoes, used by African traders to meet European ships offshore, wearing beads as both armor and statement. It was in these meetings, paddle to hull, gaze to gaze, that trade became theater. And even now, on quiet mornings in Ghana or Benin, artisans still sit by fires, melting crushed bottles and scavenged glass into beads. They use molds passed down for centuries, carve the patterns by hand, and fire them in earthen kilns. Some are made for tourists, yes, but others are made for the same reasons as before, for birth, for marriage, for protection, for beauty, for story. A modern archaeologist once remarked that if you were to dig along the coast, you might find beads lying just beneath the surface of the soil, still intact. Some the size of lentils, others of olives. Some striped, some marbled, still glistening, still patient, waiting, perhaps, for someone to remember. And so, Voyager, this is why some said the ocean was made of glass beads. Not because it glittered in the sun, though it did. Not because it was shaped by trade, though it was. But because when you hold a bead in your palm, cool, curved, flawed, you hold more than glass. You hold passage. You hold the weight of 1,000 hands. Giving, receiving, refusing, remembering. You hold a piece of an ocean that shimmered with longing and loss. And you hold, most of all, something made to last. So let the breeze come now, slow and warm, like breath across water. Let it carry you not only to sleep, but to the places where glass turned to memory, and memory to tide. Drift there gently. The waves are quiet tonight, and the beads, still glowing somewhere below, are singing stories in a language soft as sand. Sleep well, Voyager. Welcome, Voyager. On our second tale of the night, we sail into the Tyrrhenian Sea, to an island that has been burning for longer than any man-made lighthouse has stood. A mountain whose voice is made of fire and whose rhythm has kept the time for passing ships for more than 2,000 years. Its name is Stromboli, one of the Aeolian islands north of Sicily. And while most volcanoes sleep between their tempers, this one never truly rests. Mariners have steered by its glow since before history was written down, and the sea charts of empires past marked it not only for its danger, but for its guidance. If you have ever wondered what it would be like to live next door to a drummer who never missed a beat for 20 centuries, Stromboli is the maritime version. Before we set sail, I'll ask a small favor. If you find these voyages worth your time, like and subscribe, and leave your current coordinates in the comments. That way I'll know where in the world you're listening from. And if your waters hold a story worth telling in the future, we may just navigate there together. So let the air around you be still for now. Feel the faint salt of the sea on the breeze, the sound of water moving under a wooden hull. We'll take the night watch together. Our story tonight begins at the edge of the Italian peninsula, in waters that connect Rome's ancient trade routes with the open Mediterranean. Long before the Romans themselves, this sea was a highway for Phoenicians, Greeks, and Etruscans, each of them reliant on what they could see from their decks. There were no sextants here yet, no compasses in European hands, only the known lines of coast and the marks of the horizon. And in the Tyrrhenian, one of the most certain of those marks was a fire in the night, far from any mainland shore. Stromboli's eruption style is unusual. Instead of long silences broken by catastrophic blasts, it produces small, rhythmic bursts every few minutes. The ancient Greeks knew this, though they couldn't explain it. They believed the mountain to be a forge of the god Hephaestus, where divine weapons were hammered out in steady measure. When they saw sparks leap into the sky and fade into darkness, they imagined celestial metalwork taking place deep under the sea. In time, this belief passed to the Romans, who renamed the god Vulcan but kept the image of the fire as his signal to sailors. By the classical period, Stromboli was already acting as a guidepost. Ships leaving the Strait of Messina for the westward run toward Sardinia or Spain would note the island to their starboard or port and know their bearing. Greek and Roman itineraries, carved in stone or written on papyrus, marked the Aeolian Islands as a group, but only Stromboli had a reputation for being visible even on a moonless night. The island itself is small, barely 12 square kilometers above the waterline, but what rises beneath the waves is far larger. Stromboli is the summit of a mountain more than 2,000 meters tall if measured from the seafloor, a near-perfect cone broken on one side by a steep ravine known as the Sierra del Fuoco, the Stream of Fire. It is here that most of the incandescent rock falls back to Earth after each eruption, rolling down the slope and hissing into the water. For anyone at sea within a dozen miles, this is the image they remember: a mountain exhaling sparks in a slow, patient rhythm. Medieval mariners from Amalfi, Pisa, and later Genoa and Venice used it as a natural beacon. Long before the first great masonry lighthouses of Europe, Stromboli was already the Faro di Mediterraneo, the lighthouse of the Mediterranean. Its glow could be spotted at distances where no man-made lamp of the time could compete. This gave it value beyond beauty. In an era when the risk of losing your position in open water could mean shipwreck, the sight of Stromboli meant certainty. By the 13th century, the Aeolian Islands had become contested points between Norman, Aragonese, and Angevin powers, but Stromboli itself was rarely fortified. Its population was small, its value strategic only in that it was there, glowing and audible. Sailors spoke of hearing it before they saw it, a distant thump in the stillness, followed by the faint scent of smoke on the wind. These details appear not only in seafarers' logs but in the letters of pilgrims traveling to and from the Holy Land, whose galleys passed this way. When the magnetic compass began to spread through Europe in the late medieval period, Stromboli did not lose its role. Instruments could tell you which way you were pointing, but they could not yet tell you where you were. Mariners still fixed their position by triangulating with known points, and the volcano remained one of the most reliable. For the people living on Stromboli, the volcano was simply part of life. Fishing villages clung to the coast, their houses painted white to stand out in the strong sun. Nets were hung to dry on stone walls, and small vineyards climbed the slopes where ash had enriched the soil. Oral tradition preserved countless stories about the volcano's moods, each eruption remembered in relation to what it had interrupted: a wedding procession, a feast day, a boat launch. But the steady beat of its smaller bursts rarely caused alarm. Islanders used them almost like a clock, telling time between one and the next. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when European trade expanded and large convoys moved between Naples, Palermo, and Barcelona, Stromboli's light became a meeting point. Captains would agree to pass within sight of the volcano so that their ships could rejoin after storms or delays. Written accounts from these voyages describe nights in which several vessels approached the island from different points on the horizon, each spotting the same orange bloom and steering toward it until their silhouettes converged. Scientific curiosity about the volcano grew in the 19th century. Geologists noted its unusual constancy, and in 1890 the Italian volcanologist Giuseppe Mercalli described Stromboli's behavior in terms that remain the standard today. The term Strombolian eruption now describes moderate, regular bursts of incandescent material, found in a handful of other volcanoes around the world, but Stromboli itself remains the type example. And yet, despite the science, the mariner's experience has changed little. A ship approaching Stromboli by night still sees much the same sight as a Phoenician trader might have 3,000 years ago: a black cone against the stars, lit from within by a heartbeat of fire. As the 19th century turned toward the 20th, steam replaced sail on the Mediterranean, but Stromboli kept its place in the mental charts of captains. Coal-fired ships did not need the wind, but they still needed bearings. The early steam packets of the Messina, Naples route would pass within view of the volcano, passengers lining the rails to watch the bursts of orange and red against the Black Sea. Travel guides of the era began to include Stromboli in itineraries, not as a stop but as a spectacle best viewed from the deck, especially at night. Some writers compared it to a clock tower on land, regular and unbothered by the passage of centuries. The growing science of volcanology brought new instruments to the island. In 1911, Italian researchers established one of the first permanent observation points, recording eruption intervals, plume heights, and the temperature of lava bombs as they fell. These records confirmed what sailors had always known. Stromboli's activity was remarkably consistent. While other volcanoes cycled between dormancy and violent awakening, this one worked in a measured rhythm, producing bursts every 10 to 20 minutes. During both World Wars, Stromboli's role changed but did not disappear. In the First World War, the Tyrrhenian Sea saw naval patrols and submarine activity, and Stromboli's glow was sometimes avoided by military vessels to reduce visibility to enemy eyes. But merchant shipping still passed near it, and the island's light still carried across the waves. In the Second World War, Allied forces advancing through Sicily in 1943 noted Stromboli in operational maps, partly for navigation and partly as a potential hazard to aircraft flying at night. Yet, despite bombings in nearby areas, the volcano itself was never targeted. For the island's residents, life under the volcano meant adapting to its moods. There were larger eruptions on record, such as in 1930 when a violent blast sent a pyroclastic flow down the Sierra del Fuoco into the sea, generating a small tsunami that damaged boats and shoreline houses. But even then, evacuation was temporary, and fishing resumed within weeks. The people of Stromboli had always lived with risk, weighing it against the fertile soil, abundant fishing grounds, and the steady rhythm of an island life tied to the wider Mediterranean. By the 1950s, the island began to attract not just scientists but artists and filmmakers. Roberto Rossellini's 1950 film Stromboli brought international attention to the island, its stark volcanic slopes providing a dramatic backdrop for Ingrid Bergman's performance. The movie depicted the struggle between human endurance and an indifferent natural force, a theme that matched the island's reality. After its release, more travelers came not by necessity but by curiosity, booking passage on ferries from Milazzo or Naples simply to walk the black sand beaches and hear the distant roar from the crater. Still, the mariner's view remained unchanged. Navigational charts of the period, British Admiralty, Italian Navy, and French Hydrographic Service, all marked Stromboli with a special symbol indicating visible volcanic glow. Sailing directions described it as an excellent night mark in clear weather, and noted that even in daylight, the plume of gas above the summit could be seen from more than 20 miles away. The volcano's influence extended beyond the Tyrrhenian. Stories of its steady fire circulated among mariners who had never been near it, passed along in the same way that tales of Cape Horn or the Strait of Malacca did. For sailors on long voyages, these stories were markers in a mental map of the world, places that carried weight even if never visited. In the latter half of the 20th century, Stromboli also became an outdoor laboratory. Researchers from universities across Europe installed seismic sensors and thermal cameras, building one of the most closely monitored volcanic sites in the world. This did not change the fact that most of its eruptions were small enough to be considered background noise to the islanders. Ferries still docked at the villages of Stromboli and Ginestra. Fishermen still set out before dawn, and at night the bursts continued as they had for centuries. It is worth noting that Stromboli's role in navigation has always been informal, a partnership between nature and seamanship rather than a codified system. No government or maritime authority ever declared it an official lighthouse, yet it has functioned as one longer than any constructed beacon. Mariners did not depend on it exclusively, but they counted on it being there, just as they counted on the stars overhead. One of the enduring qualities of Stromboli is how little its appearance has changed in the context of human time. A Roman merchantman in the 2nd century BCE and a container ship in the 21st century can both see the same silhouette and the same bursts of light. This continuity is rare in navigation, where coastlines may shift, ports may be dredged or abandoned, and man-made markers replaced. Stromboli's signal, by contrast, is tied to a deep geological engine far older than any human chart. The Aeolian Islands themselves have been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2000, with Stromboli singled out for its exemplary volcanic activity. This recognition did not alter its daily life much, but it brought a renewed awareness of its global significance. Tourists now join evening boat tours that circle the Sierra del Fuoco after sunset, watching the same glowing arcs that once guided merchant fleets. But for all the scientific monitoring, Stromboli has its surprises. In December 2002, a significant eruption sent a large volume of material into the sea, generating a tsunami up to 10 meters high along parts of the island. No lives were lost, but the event reminded both residents and visitors that the volcano's heartbeat can quicken unexpectedly. Navigation warnings were issued, and for a brief time ships gave the island a wider berth. Yet within months, activity returned to its steady rhythm, and so did maritime traffic. Today, the approach to Stromboli from the south remains one of the most distinctive entries into the Tyrrhenian Sea. A ship coming up from the Strait of Messina sees the other Aeolian islands, first Lipari, Salina, Panaria, their shapes changing as the course shifts. Then, on the horizon, the unmistakable cone of Stromboli appears, its summit tipped with a glow that is neither sunrise nor sunset. For a mariner who knows the sea, this sight is not merely scenic. It is a confirmation of position, a welcome landmark in a world where GPS satellites now hum overhead but where old habits still matter. The sound, too, still carries. In calm weather, the soft thud of each eruption travels across the water, a low note felt as much as heard. Sailors have spoken of it like a drumbeat marking the passing of the watch, or a reminder that time at sea is measured in more than hours and knots. To stand on a deck and hear it, knowing that generations before you have done the same, is to feel the continuity of navigation itself. The island sleeps only in the sense that it rests between bursts. For the mariner, it never sleeps at all. In the present day, Stromboli's role in guiding ships has shifted from necessity to tradition, yet it still holds a place in the mariner's mind. Container vessels moving between the major ports of Genoa, Naples, and Palermo pass within sight of its peak, their navigation handled by satellite and radar, but their officers still noting the glow in the night. Ferry captains on the Milazzo Stromboli route know the waters in all seasons, steering by digital charts but greeting the volcano as if it were an old colleague standing watch. Tourism has amplified the island's image. Photographs of nighttime eruptions, taken from the decks of tour boats, now circulate widely, their fiery arcs appearing on travel blogs and postcards. For many visitors, seeing Stromboli from the water is the closest they will come to the experience of those who once sailed by it in the age before modern aids to navigation. Guides explain that this is one of the few places on Earth where active volcanism and human settlement exist in such close and enduring proximity. The sound of the eruptions, they point out, is not a roar but a steady breath, a physical rhythm that seems to pace itself for human notice. Mariners of the old school speak of the volcano in the same way they might speak of a headland or a favored anchorage, not because they rely on it now, but because they learned to trust it before electronics took over. In conversations in shipboard mess rooms, the volcano often appears alongside stories of other natural guides. The loom of Mount Etna on the Sicilian horizon, the scent of land carried on the wind before reaching Madeira, the distinctive profile of Gibraltar seen from miles away. Each of these is a point of orientation, a reassurance that the sea has its own set of fixed markers. For sailors who have rounded Stromboli under sail, there is still a moment in the approach when the glow is first sighted. It might be in the small hours of the morning watch, with the sea flat and the air cool, when a faint orange pulse shows itself against the blackness ahead. With every 10 or 15 minutes, it blooms again, marking time as reliably as a metronome. This is when the volcano's nickname, the lighthouse of the Mediterranean, makes sense, not as a romantic phrase but as a literal description. The volcano's rhythm has also found its way into scientific literature. Geologists describe Strombolian eruptions as a specific style of volcanic activity, moderate in size but frequent, characterized by bursts of incandescent lava fragments thrown into the air. This type of activity is named after Stromboli itself, giving the island a legacy in earth science as well as in maritime lore. The term Strombolian eruption appears in textbooks, expedition reports, and hazard assessments worldwide, making the island both a local landmark and a global reference point. The human connection to this place is layered. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Aeolian Islands were visited and possibly settled by Bronze Age peoples, who navigated the Mediterranean in small craft long before the Phoenicians or Greeks arrived. Whether they understood the volcano as a guide, a threat, or a sacred presence is unknown, but the same bursts they saw would be recognizable to anyone today. In the Middle Ages, the island was mentioned in portolan charts, those practical navigational maps with coastlines and compass roses that guided mariners along trade routes. A mariner leaving Messina for Naples could use Stromboli's plume as a way to confirm his course long before his vessel drew near enough to see the details of the coast. Life on Stromboli remains defined by the volcano's presence. The main village lies on the northeastern shore, with narrow streets of whitewashed houses, each with a view of the sea. The smaller village of Ginastra, reachable only by boat, faces the southwest and has no harbor large enough for vehicles. Supplies are ferried in on small craft, just as they have been for centuries. From either village, the Sierra del Fuoco, the great slope where most of the lava is ejected, is visible, a reminder that the island is never entirely still. When the sea is calm and the air is clear, one can stand on the deck of a passing ship and imagine the centuries of vessels that have done the same. Roman merchantmen bearing amphorae of wine and oil, Arab dhows trading along the Sicilian coast, Genoese galleys returning from the Levant, and modern ferries loaded with cars and tourists, all have looked to the same glow. The volcano's voice, a muffled detonation followed by the hiss of falling cinders, has accompanied their passage like the refrain of a song. Even in the age of satellite navigation, maritime training includes an awareness of visual bearings. Captains remind their crews that technology can fail, that storms can disrupt signals, that electronics can be rendered useless by power loss. In such moments, knowing the coastline and its landmarks becomes more than tradition, it becomes survival. In the Tyrrhenian Sea, Stromboli is one of those landmarks. It will not give you latitude and longitude, but it will tell you where you are in relation to the world around it. Night approaches are still the most memorable. A vessel rounding the southern edge of the Aeolian chain will first see the volcano's base as a black wedge against the dim horizon. Then, as darkness deepens, the glow appears, not constant but rhythmic, a beacon that keeps its own time. Passengers on modern cruise liners gather at the rails for this sight, their voices hushed, their cameras ready. Crew members glance at it as they go about their duties, noting it almost subconsciously, as generations before them did. In literature, Stromboli sometimes appears as a metaphor for endurance, for constancy in the midst of change. But for the people who sail past it, such symbolism is unnecessary. It is enough to know that here is a piece of the earth that has been speaking in the same voice for 2,000 years, marking the hours for those who travel the sea. The volcano asks nothing of them and expects nothing in return, yet it gives them a point of reference, a fixed place in a shifting world. As the ship sails on, the glow fades astern, its rhythm becoming memory. The sea stretches ahead, the course marked now by instruments and charts. But somewhere behind, the volcano continues its quiet work, unseen but still singing. For the mariner, that is comfort enough, to know that even when out of sight, Stromboli is there, keeping its watch. And so, our voyage through the story of the volcano's song ends as many real voyages have ended, with Stromboli receding into the distance, its last burst seen between swells, its voice fading into the hum of the ship. It has been a companion on the passage, a reminder that in the vastness of the sea, there are places that hold fast, glowing and steady, guiding not because they are told to, but because that is what they have always done. Good night. Welcome, Voyager. Somewhere between sunlight and mist, there lives a moment when the sky splits into seven. A quiet prism arches across the sea, and for just a heartbeat, it seems to touch the horizon like a bridge. On our third story of the night, we follow a man who thought it did. One sailor, in the early 18th century, convinced himself that if he followed a rainbow, it would lead him to land. Not metaphorically, not in the whimsical way poets mean, but literally, charting it with compass and ink as though it were a coastline that only appeared when the sun was behind him. The sea has never been short on strange pursuits. Mariners once mistook whales for islands, mapped wind as though it were a mountain range, and labeled fog with the names of saints. This sailor, whose name was recorded just once in a faded margin of a Dutch logbook, spent 7 days turning his ship gently eastward, always toward the next colored bend in the sky. You could say he was chasing something impossible, but honestly, isn't that the most traditional form of navigation there is? It's hard to talk about rainbows seriously without sounding a little lightheaded. But then again, every map is a form of hope, and hope can be a slippery kind of compass. Before we dive in, if you're still with us, go ahead and like this voyage with a soft tap, and leave us a coordinate in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Who knows, perhaps a future story wins its way to your harbor next. For now, breathe in gently. Let the sea breeze wrap around your shoulders like a shawl of salt and thyme. Let the creak of an old deck and the hush of distant waters guide your thoughts. Let yourself rest. Our story tonight sets sail at the edge of a chart, somewhere west of the Azores, and follows a trail of light that touches the sea like a promise. The logbook itself comes from a small collection held in Amsterdam, part of a weather-stained bundle of maritime records that mostly catalog wind speeds, cargo lists, and dull bartering agreements between merchants whose names have long since vanished from tradehouse signs. But one entry, dated June 18, 1723, stands out, not for its drama, but for its odd serenity. The first mate aboard the Helena Maria, a merchant vessel heading westward toward Martinique, wrote that a deckhand named Elise van der Meer had begun standing watch at the stern rather than the bow, eyes fixed not on where the ship was going, but on where it had just been. He claimed he had seen a rainbow the day before that dipped its arc into the sea like the corner of a banner, and that he had dreamed in color that night for the first time in months. In his dream, the rainbow reached down and pulled him toward a green coastline that shimmered like fish scales. He woke up before he landed, but he was certain it meant something. Sailors are famously prone to believing in signs, especially when the sea offers them nothing but repetition. Elise convinced the helmsman, through a mix of persistence and careful ration bribing, to adjust their course by a single degree. Then another the next day, and another. By day 3, the captain grew curious and not especially bothered. since the wind favored them either way and the cargo was mostly cheap flax bound for plantation rope making. What harm, he reasoned, in a little wandering? Besides, morale was unusually high. The crew spoke of bright dreams and lucky sightings. A pod of dolphins kept pace with them for hours one morning, and the galley's bread stayed fresh longer than it had on any other crossing. The ship's cat, who typically disliked everyone, even purred. This kind of slow, joyful misdirection has long roots in maritime tradition. There are records, especially among Polynesian navigators, of steering by instinct rather than star, choosing to follow clouds, bird patterns, or even the shimmer of the sea's surface. The ancient Greeks believed that Iris, the rainbow goddess, carried messages from the gods across the sky, leaving trails behind her. In the Andaman Islands, fishermen still speak of fishbows, low-lying rainbow arcs that appear over certain shoals, signs, they say, that the fish are moving below. Even in 18th century Europe, when navigational science had begun to stiffen with math and reason, the sea remained too big, too unknowable to resist the occasional bit of color-led whimsy. By day 4, Elise was keeping a separate log. It doesn't survive in full, only excerpts, copied over by the ship's quartermaster who found the entries strange enough to transcribe. In them, Elise described the sea's hues with painterly attention. Morning, pale blue with gray beneath, like the belly of a herring, or noon, sea streaked with green, as though the rainbow had leaped. He wrote of floating bits of driftwood that he believed were from trees not native to the West Indies, and birds whose calls he swore he hadn't heard before. To him, these were signs of land just beyond view, bent out of sight by the curve of the earth. That's what the rainbow was doing, he reasoned. It wasn't pointing straight at land, it was arching just like the planet. You simply had to follow its line for long enough. There's a beauty to this kind of logic, especially in an age where almost everything had already been claimed or charted. For a sailor like Elise, land was less about property than possibility. The idea that something new could still lie ahead, even if it was unreachable, even if it disappeared with the light, was enough to shift the ship's course without any fight at all. On day 5, the crew began taking turns spotting the rainbow. Seen between 6th and 7th bell, one wrote, colors sharpest near the violet end, fades in an hour. Elise says we are close. The wind remained calm. The sea mirrored the sky. They moved forward like a needle following thread. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the ship's captain, one Willem Dirks, eventually began to grow uneasy. Not angry, not yet, but cautious. Every day spent drifting off course was another day the winds might turn, and there were whispers that if the rainbow led nowhere, the crew would be days behind without extra provisions. Yet even he could not deny the gentle spell that had settled over the vessel. There were no fights, no sickness, no spoiled barrels. A kind of hush had filled the space between sails, as though the sea itself were listening. Then came day 6. The wind pressed gently from the northwest now, not as a force but as a breath. The colors above had narrowed, no longer wide like the sweep of a cathedral arch, but precise, as if the rainbow had grown serious. Its ends no longer wandered. They pointed, one toward a pale blue sky, the other directly ahead, toward a place the sailor could not yet see. His logbook notes for the morning were written with an unusually steady hand. Rainbow fainter, arc lower, sea warm to touch, bow pointing southwest, wind consistent, provisions at half. He did not record his own thoughts. Not that day. What he felt could not be measured in ink, and the language he knew seemed too loud for it. Around midday, he spotted a patch of ocean that looked different. Not in color, but in motion, pulsed, not with tide or wind, but as if something beneath had exhaled. He slowed the sails, let the sloop drift, and leaned over the edge. The surface held a film, not oil, not plant, but a fine shimmer like powdered mica. It tasted faintly of copper and citrus, and the air grew momentarily cooler, like he had crossed into a shadow without clouds. A cluster of gulls circled above, though no land was visible. They screamed only once, then flew on without interest. That was the first time he questioned whether he was nearing anything at all. A sailor can convince himself of many things, but the body knows better. He felt no fear, but something had changed. He passed through the shimmer and back into clearer water. The rainbow, which had faded briefly, returned brighter than ever, now braided with a second, thinner arc that floated just beneath it, like a ghost. He had never seen a double rainbow, let alone one that followed him for days. Yet there it was. He called it the shadow bow, the one that told no stories, made no promises, only followed. That night, the stars returned. For 5 nights they had been veiled by haze and high cloud, but now the sky was bare. He climbed to the top of the foredeck with a chart, a quadrant, and one hope: to find Polaris and mark a position. He located it easily, fixed, cold, familiar. He made his calculations, adjusted for drift, and realized with a start that he had not moved far in distance. Only direction. The rainbow had curved him. He checked the winds, checked the sails, checked the logbook. All consistent. He had moved steadily each day, but the chart said otherwise. He had been led in a circle, not a perfect one, but near enough to bring him within 30 nautical miles of where he'd begun. He set down the quadrant and simply sat. The stars above were indifferent, and the sea gave no sign of deceit. He looked at the bow of his boat, then back at the rainbow still there. He did not curse it. He did not smile either. He simply continued. Near dawn on the 7th day, he spotted something on the horizon. A smudge, low and unmoving. It wasn't cloud. It wasn't ship. As the sun broke the surface, the smear resolved into a chain of gray shapes. Rock, perhaps. Low, uneven, rising just a few feet above the sea. He raised the glass to his eye. The lenses were salt-scuffed, but he could make out details. A reef, long, narrow, sloping away toward the south. No trees, no sand, just stone and the dark lines of cormorants perched in neat rows. And at the very center of it, something stranger. It rose no higher than a man's shoulder, an arch made not of driftwood or coral, but metal. Iron, he guessed, rusted but intact. Its shape was deliberate, too smooth to be natural, too isolated to be accidental. It stood alone, rising from the rock like a gate with nothing behind it. He circled the reef cautiously, sounding the depth. Shallows here could tear a hull open in seconds, but the water was still, the tides gentle. He brought the sloop in slowly, anchor dropped at 40 feet. Then he rowed in alone. The reef was warm underfoot, dry despite the spray. The cormorants scattered, their wings beating against the quiet. He approached the arch. There was no inscription, no rope, no bell, no offering. Just a single nail embedded at the top, from which hung a strip of blue cloth, bleached and tattered. And yet, above it the rainbow split in two. One arc passed to the right, the other to the left, both ending in the sea beyond the reef. As if whatever power had guided it now passed the burden on, offering 2 directions and no advice. He stood beneath the arch and looked forward. The ocean opened before him, calm, unreadable. The breeze held no scent of land. Behind him, his ship waited, quiet as a tomb. He stayed on the reef for hours. He touched the stone, walked the same paths again and again, listened for any sound beyond his own breathing. But the sea does not speak in voices, only gestures. He returned to the boat at dusk. The rainbow was gone. In its place, a low fog had risen, barely knee-high, clinging to the surface like a blanket. The sky above remained clear. Stars glittered. The sea beneath was soft. He wrote only one thing that night. Rainbow ended at the arch. I do not know what began. And when he woke the next morning, the reef had vanished. There was no reef, no arch, no cloth, only water, wide, blank, and flat, with not even the hiss of distant wave break to prove what he'd seen. He stood on the deck and watched the sea for an hour, then two, then longer, hoping for a break in the mist or a dark line on the horizon. Nothing came. His anchor rope was still wet. The chain held tiny barnacle flecks, as if it had scraped against something hard. But there was no trace. Not even the gulls returned. By noon, he turned the bow toward the south. There was no direction left to follow but the one his instincts trusted. His compass spun weakly, as if trying to remember how to behave. The wind came lightly, unsure of its own allegiance. He sailed in silence. That night the stars stayed hidden again, not by cloud, but by a kind of luminous haze, a blue film above, as though the sky itself was unsure how to be dark. He drifted for hours in a windless plain, listening. He kept expecting the creak of rigging or the usual groan of hull against sea, but there was too much stillness. Just past midnight he saw light, not starlight, not the hard flare of another ship. This was a reflection, a slow gliding shimmer that passed beneath the hull like moonlight on glass, except there was no moon, and the shimmer moved with purpose. He leaned over the railing and watched it pass under the sloop, long and faint and curved, a ring, a circle of light. He moved to the stern and watched it fade into the black, unsure if it had ever really been there. His logbook says little of that night, just one line, penned in cramped letters. A circle of light passed beneath. I followed it until it was gone. On the 9th morning, the horizon broke again, but not with land, with color, not like the rainbow, not full, just two parallel bars, low and faint, like stripes of mist that had not yet decided to rise or fall. One was green, the other gold. They rested on the water like laid brushstrokes, so quiet he thought he might be imagining them. He turned toward them out of instinct more than decision. The wind caught just enough sail to allow a glide. He followed the colors. By noon, the green faded, the gold remained, and with it the temperature rose, not sharply but steadily. The air grew dense, humid, metallic. Sweat formed on his arms even while the sails barely moved. There was no sun, but the brightness was total, not hot, but overwhelming, like being watched by something vast and polite. Then came the birds, not seabirds, not gulls or shearwaters or frigates. These flew low and in silence, their wings long and narrow, their bodies dark but not black. They circled once, then again, and vanished into the haze. He could not say what kind they were. His journals made no guess. That afternoon, the gold dissolved, not upward, but downward, as if sucked into the sea. The ocean that had once mirrored color now turned milky, not cloudy, milky, as if filled with something that had been stirred too long. He leaned over again. The surface shimmered with a pale film, and beneath it, he saw something that made him recoil. A shape, not moving, not alive, just resting on the ocean floor, still and vast. Perfect circle, etched into the sand. The size of a cathedral dome, maybe more. Not a ruin, not a reef, just a depression so precise it looked painted. Around its edge were lines, 12 of them, radiating out like a sundial, vanishing into the darker deep. He couldn't measure it. He didn't try. He dropped no anchor, took no soundings. He only watched. The circle held nothing in it. Not a stone, not a fish, not a shadow. Just pale, blank stillness. When he finally looked up, he realized the sky had gone dark. Not with weather, not with night, but as if the dome of the world had gently dimmed, allowing only a gray veil through which light had no shape. He took the tiller and moved on. He sailed for 2 more days. He saw no land, no birds, no reef, no rainbow. He did not stop. He did not anchor. The stars never returned. When he reached port again weeks later, the men who helped him dock said he looked normal, but too clean, as if he had passed through something that washed the memory from him. His ship showed no signs of damage. The sails were whole. The hull was dry. His provisions were low but not gone. He told no one where he had been. His journal, recovered after his death, recorded everything. Day by day, from the moment he left harbor to the day the rainbow vanished. There were no fantastical descriptions, just facts. Wind, water, bearings, shapes, colors, a few lines of curiosity, no mention of fear, no conclusion. The final page held no entry, just a drawn circle, done with compass and ruler. Around it, 12 lines, radiating outward. At the top, a single word, begin. No map was found, no coordinates. No storm had been logged in the area during the days he claimed to have sailed. No one else saw the rainbow. No one else reported a reef. His route, traced by experts, made no logical arc. It doubled, curved, and returned over itself, as if he had followed something not bound by horizon, but by pattern. And still, to this day, a certain kind of sailor, the ones who don't ask for radio or charts or certainty, claim that after certain rains, if the sun is low and the air is warm, you might find a bow in the sky that does not move with the wind. It does not touch the sea, touches you, and once it does, you will not see the same stars again, not because they have changed, but because you have. Sleep well, voyager, and should you ever dream of circles that float in water, or arches that appear without land, remember, some maps were never meant to be drawn, only followed, until they disappear. Welcome once again, Voyager. On our final story of the night, we open a map that kept its edges soft with use. A map that grew like a village, by hand and by habit, over centuries. This is a story of the medieval mappa mundi and maps like it, of pilgrims who added notes and margins, of scribes who corrected coastlines with a single stroke, and of a slow mosaic made by ink and memory, not by one single cartographer's hand. If you have ever unfolded a map and found a coffee stain in an unexpected place, you understand part of the point. Maps carry lives as much as directions. And if you enjoy these slow boardings into history, please like and subscribe, and drop a coordinate in the comments below. Tell us where you are listening from, and if your town or road has a story, perhaps a pilgrim's mark, we may walk it in a later episode. Now, make yourself comfortable. Set your shoulders to rest, let your jaw unclench, and let the breath lengthen like a tide. Picture a small chapel by a road, a wooden table scarred with knives and candle wax, a handful of pilgrims arriving at dusk. Hear the rustle of a leather satchel as someone unrolls a parchment, the soft scrape of a quill as ink is mixed, the low murmur of prayers and stories traded by firelight. Breathe to that music for a moment, settle, and when you are ready, listen. Our story tonight begins in the crowded routes of medieval Christendom, where roads ran like threads between shrines, and where pilgrimage was more a rhythm of life than an oddity. The best-known surviving example of the sort of map we mean is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around the end of the 13th century, but its lineage begins earlier and spreads far beyond one cathedral wall. These maps were not primarily tools for navigation as modern charts are. They were worldviews rendered in pigment. They were compendia of knowledge, scripture, history, and local memory. They showed seas and rivers, kingdoms and monsters, but they also held notes. A shrine visited by a notable pilgrim, a miracle recorded by a monk, a toll road marked by a border stone. Over time, as these documents were copied, annotated, and sometimes patched together from older scraps, they acquired new layers, and some maps effectively accreted over generations until they became collections assembled gradually, as people added what they thought important. Pilgrims who traveled from Santiago to Canterbury, from Rome to Jerusalem, carried with them not only relics and prayers, but also small pieces of knowledge, which they sometimes set down in books, glosses, or on loose scraps that later made their way into more formal maps. Monastic scriptoria copied earlier exemplars, but they also allowed margins to fill with updates. A monk would note that a road was flooded in spring, or that a bridge had been rebuilt by a kindly lord, and these marginalia, once useful, sometimes migrated into the next generation's map faces. The process was organic, slow, and local at first, then cumulative. Over a century or two, a map could be heavily reworked. Over several centuries, it could bear evidence of changing trade routes, shifting political boundaries, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge about distant shores. The Mappa Mundi tradition itself is not a single map, but a family of approaches. Some were ecclesiastical, centered on Jerusalem as the navel of the world, oriented east at the top, and populated with biblical scenes. Others were portolans and itineraries for mariners, dense with compass roses and coastal detail but sparse in interior lore. The interplay between these kinds of maps is where our thousand-year tale finds its smallest gestures and largest changes. A coastal port once added carefully to a mariner's chart might, in time, be copied into a Mappa Mundi and given an anecdote. A saint's tomb here, a miraculous spring there. Conversely, religious notation might find its way onto a mariner's chart as a warning to sailors. A shoreline marked by a chapel where sailors left votive offerings after surviving storms. To make this more concrete, consider the way medieval manuscripts were compiled. The labor was incremental. A scribe would copy a template, illuminate key passages, and then leave space for later hand. A map might start as a circle AT and an O, the classical scheme that placed east at the top and divided the known world into three parts. Then an abbot or visiting bishop might add local knowledge. A monastery placed carefully along a river, a note that pilgrims could find lodging a day's march from the cathedral, an inscription that warns of brigands on a particular hill. These additions were not cosmetic. They changed how readers understood distance and safety. They ordained routes. They turned fleeting observations into part of collective memory. Over decades, as each new hand augmented the document, the map was effectively rewritten with the authority of multiple voices. That is how some maps became unfinished in the sense that they never reached a point of finality. They were always open to added voices. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, for example, though an impressive, lavish object in its own right, also contains palimpsests of historical layering. It presents Jerusalem at the center. It outlines biblical geography. And yet it also contains marginal notes that reflect later historical events. A monk or a pilgrim entering the cathedral and spotting a blank space might add a comment about a newly founded monastery or an unusual relic recently exhibited. In that way, the map is alive. It absorbs claims and corrections slowly, as if the world itself were being remembered one marginal note at a time. Pilgrimage culture made this possible. When tens of thousands walked in cycles toward the great shrines, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, their stories fed into a network of memory. Local priests recorded unusual donations. Travelers passed on information about safe bridges. Abbots exchanged news of famine or plague. A map served as a node in this network. It was a place where the practical and the sacred met. When a pilgrim added a note, it was not an act of vanity. It was a contribution to communal safety, to the knowledge that would guide the next walker. Over a millennium, that practice produced a mosaic of place that no single author could have conceived. In addition to pilgrims and monks, merchants and maritime navigators contributed to the map's slow accretion. Portolan charts, emerging in the later medieval period along the Mediterranean coasts, were practical tools for sea captains, densely annotated with compass bearings. When a Portolan's detailed coastal notation was copied into a pelagic map, it brought new factual precision to what had been schematic. Conversely, a Mappamundi's narrative could be grafted into a merchant's album, where a cosmographical vignette might be used to illustrate trade links or explain the origin of certain merchant guilds. This cross-pollination between devotional maps and practical charts, between town records and pilgrim notes, is what lent some maps the texture of a 1,000-year project. They were never finished because the participants, a multitude of small hands, always had something to add. By the later Middle Ages, as universities grew and royal courts demanded more precise maps for administration and warfare, some of these living maps were superseded by more technical cartography. Yet the habit of annotating maps did not disappear. State surveyors recorded roads and borders with instruments and measurements, but local knowledge continued to be valuable. A soldier moving through terrain still wanted to know whether a ford was safe in August, and a magistrate still valued the note that a certain lord had built a toll in a place that affected trade. Thus, the ancestral practice of marginal annotation threaded its way into more modern cartographic work, surviving as footnotes, surveyor's marks, and, occasionally, as a deliberately preserved trace in museum copies. As the centuries wore on, the very idea of a map that could be finished shifted. The age of exploration introduced new lands, new oceans, and new peoples into European cartography, and that rapid expansion made the slow, cumulative model feel both quaint and necessary. On the one hand, a map that grew by marginalia seemed inadequate in the face of transoceanic empires. On the other hand, the practice of adding local, human detail, pilgrim's note, merchant's warning, monastery's claim, remained crucial to understanding lived space, and it endures in ways we still practice today. After the era of pilgrim annotations and monastic editions, the story of the Mappamundi and its kin moves into a period when Europe's intellectual curiosity flourished alongside religious devotion. The 12th and 13th centuries saw the rise of universities, new translations of ancient texts, and a growing interest in geography that blended observation with inherited knowledge. In this context, maps were not only practical tools or devotional objects. They became portals into how the medieval mind sought to reconcile the known and the unknown. One of the key figures linked to this era is Isidore of Seville, whose encyclopedic works helped preserve classical knowledge through turbulent centuries. His descriptions of the world, though sometimes fanciful, provided a foundation that later mapmakers referred to. His understanding of the world as a circle divided into three parts, Europe, Asia, and Africa, became the conceptual skeleton on which many Mappamundi were constructed. Pilgrims following routes across these continents, even in limited ways, carried fragments of this worldview with them. Their notes and stories slowly layered onto manuscripts, infusing each map with lived experience. Meanwhile, the map itself became a space of storytelling, where places were marked not only by their physical presence, but by their significance in human memory and legend. Monsters prowled the edges of the known world. Rivers bore biblical names, and cities glowed with saints' legends. The Mappamundi's creator was both cartographer and storyteller, scribe and theologian. Every border and coastline, every mountain and sea, held a lesson or a caution, and pilgrims, scribes, and merchants contributed to this ongoing narrative, bringing pieces of the wider world into the map's mosaic. This gradual accretion was not without its complications. Over the centuries, as maps passed from hand to hand, the layering of notes and corrections sometimes resulted in contradictions and confusion. A coastal town might be shifted slightly east or west in a later copy. A river might change course on the parchment as a scribe reinterpreted a text, and names might multiply or fade. These discrepancies reveal not carelessness but the nature of knowledge in transition. Fluid, contested, and incomplete. Some maps bore signs of repair, glued-on patches, or added scrolls of parchment. These physical alterations mirrored the intellectual process. The world was not fixed on a single sheet, but was an evolving puzzle, made more precise with each traveler's note, each new journey undertaken. Some scholars today study these layers as archaeologists study strata, peeling back centuries of edits to glimpse medieval thinking, travel routes, and cultural exchanges. The pilgrims themselves, often anonymous, were the unwitting cartographers of this slow project. A farmer's son who journeyed to Santiago might record a safe river crossing. A scholar returning from Rome might note the political tensions in a city-state, and a merchant might warn of pirates off a particular shore. Each edition was a stitch in a fabric of shared understanding. Over a millennium, this made maps not only guides but living documents of memory, faith, and geography. A particularly fascinating example of this process is the so-called Ebstorf map, a large medieval mappa mundi rediscovered in the 19th century. Though tragically destroyed during World War II, photographs and descriptions reveal a tapestry of images, texts, and annotations that reflect centuries of addition. It is a map where the world is both cosmos and moral lesson, where geography and theology entwine. On it, one finds biblical scenes alongside depictions of exotic animals and notes on distant peoples, each contributed by hands separated by time and place. As time passed, some maps shifted from communal projects to commissioned works by scholars and royal cartographers. These maps often aimed for greater accuracy and utility, motivated by political or economic needs. Still, they retained the medieval habit of layered knowledge. Annotations survived, sometimes disguised as marginalia or appended notes. The process of continual refinement remained, albeit more controlled. The age of exploration intensified this trend. New continents, islands, and oceans emerged on European maps, requiring urgent updates and revisions. The slow mosaic of marginal notes was no longer enough. Surveyors, navigators, and royal patrons demanded precise charts for colonization and trade. Yet even these maps carried echoes of the earlier tradition. Place names derived from indigenous words, notes about local customs, warnings from earlier explorers. The human element persisted. Today, the idea of a map as a fixed, final product is often taken for granted. We think of maps as snapshots of space, accurate and immutable. But the story of the Mappa Mundi reminds us that maps are also stories in time, documents of human knowledge and curiosity, open to change and growth. The thousand-year process of layering, correcting, and expanding maps reflects not only geography but the unfolding of human understanding itself. As we move into the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the age of printed books dawned, and with it, the possibility of wider dissemination of maps and geographic knowledge. The Mappa Mundi tradition, rooted in centuries of gradual accretion, slowly gave way to more standardized and widely replicated maps. Yet, the spirit of that slow mosaic, the hand-by-ink stained-hand collaboration, still whispers beneath the surface. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, perhaps the most famous surviving example, painted around 1300 and measuring over 5 feet in diameter, still holds this living essence. Created for a cathedral library in England, it presents a world centered on Jerusalem, surrounded by continents, seas, cities, and myriad illustrations that tell stories of history, mythology, and faith. The edges of the map, once the mysterious domain of dragons and sea monsters, remind us how explorers and scholars grappled with the limits of the known world. For centuries, the Hereford map was both a devotional object and a geographical tool. Pilgrims visiting the cathedral would gaze upon it and find orientation, not only of place but of spirit. Scholars studied its details, piecing together the world as medieval Europe understood it. And each copy, each retelling, shaped the evolving conception of Earth. By the Renaissance, new approaches to map-making emerged, propelled by voyages of discovery and advances in mathematics and astronomy. Cartographers like Mercator and Waldseemüller introduced projections and conventions that emphasized precision and navigation. Still, even as maps grew more scientific, the centuries-old practice of adding notes and corrections by successive hands continued in some forms. Maritime charts were often annotated by captains and pilots, scribbled with corrections that later found their way into printed editions. In modern times, the idea of a collaborative, evolving map continues through digital cartography and crowdsourced projects like OpenStreetMap. Here, the spirit of the Mappa Mundi lives on, as countless individuals add their local knowledge, observations, and stories, enriching a shared global picture. Reflecting on this thousand-year journey, we see that maps are much more than tools. They are living records of humanity's relationship with the world. Each line and letter, each faded note or vibrant illustration, carries the weight of countless lives, journeys, and discoveries. They remind us that our understanding of the world is never complete but a continuous unfolding, shaped by the curiosity and care of those who come before us. Now, as you settle deeper into calm, imagine the soft crackle of candle flames, the gentle flicker of firelight playing on ancient parchment, the faint sound of distant footsteps on stone corridors where these maps once rested. Let the stories and voices of pilgrims, scribes, and explorers mingle softly with the evening breeze, carrying you gently toward rest. Thank you for joining me on this slow voyage through the centuries. If you enjoyed this journey, please like and subscribe, and leave your coordinates in the comments below. Wherever you are in the world, your place might inspire the next story we share. Until then, drift quietly with the maps of time, carried gently by the hands that trace them.